Before the throne of God above, I have a strong, a perfect plea.
Jesus tells this curious little parable in Matthew chapter 13, and he compares the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed, the tiniest of all seeds. And he says when you plant that tiny little seed and it grows and matures, it suddenly wakes up one day and it's bigger than all the other plants around it, all the shrubs. It's the biggest tree around. It begins to open its branches, he says, and invite the birds of the air, and soon the tree is full of birds who have made their nest in its branches. It's offered them a home. It's reached out to them and welcomed them in. What I've always loved about that parable is that what Jesus is saying about the kingdom of heaven is that it's not this grandiose display of power and money and prestige, but it actually starts out very small, very tiny. And what makes the kingdom of heaven so special is not its size, but its function. And Jesus makes it clear that its function is to open its branches and welcome the birds of the air and become something different than what it was when it was that tiny little seed. How God can take something so tiny, grow it into something so large. But more importantly, how He can take that tiny little seed, that kernel of passion, of truth, of courage, and He can make it into something that maybe those of us who are in this kingdom have never dreamed of. And suddenly we're no longer this tiny seed, but we're this tree that opens its branches to the least of these, to the birds of the air, to those that had nowhere to go to begin with and who need a new start, a new identity. The kingdom of heaven is like this, he says. It's meant to encourage us, to empower us to know that we start small and we start tiny, but with the function that God has given us to open ourselves to what He's doing in this community. That's empowerment right there. It's empowerment.
With Christ my Savior and my God, with Christ my Savior and my
I grew up in this area, and when I came back a couple years ago, the thing that I kept noticing over and over again was just how many people are down and out and on the streets and jumping from house to car and just living in pain and poverty. And we think a lot about the mission of the kingdom and what is the mission of the kingdom, where does it start? I think it starts where Jesus started. That's with the least of these. It starts with the estranged, the neglected, the hurt, the suffering. It starts with who Jesus called the poor in spirit. And He says that it's the poor in spirit who own the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And it's about us becoming poor in spirit. It's about us joining the poor in spirit, being a church, a community of people who are poor in spirit, who have to rely on God for everything that we need, from physical to spiritual needs. We come to trust Him, and it really makes this idea of the mustard seed growing and becoming something more than what it started out as, becoming that home. It becomes a home for us. It becomes a home for the least of these. It becomes a home. It becomes a kingdom for the poor in spirit. I remember my granddaddy every year would plant gourds, and he would plant these tiny little seeds, and they'd begin to vine, and suddenly you'd see all these green, thick, full gourds on the vine. And he would take those gourds, like many people out in the country used to do, and he'd let those gourds dry out, and he would hollow them out and put a hole right in the center of them, and he would hang them atop this really high metal pole, hang them on hooks, and pretty soon there would be these martin birds who would come, and they would make their nest in these old hollowed out gourds. And at night you could sit out on the porch in the summertime, and you could see the sun kind of setting, And you could hear those martin birds up in those gourds in their nest, flying around at dusk, chasing the mosquitoes off. And I remember thinking, looking at those gourds, how could he have seen something different there? How could he have looked at a gourd and seen a home for a bird? Something that seemed so useless. People aren't cooking and eating gourds. It seemed like it had no function otherwise, and yet he could look at that gourd and see a home there for birds, and the birds would keep the mosquitoes away, and it would kind of complete this circle of the design of God. If we choose to embrace the kingdom here in Albertville and live out its message and spread its peace and the good news that Jesus has come, the good news that Jesus is coming again, I think we have to begin to understand our mission and identity and function in a brand new way, in ways that we've never seen anything. We have to look at our church the way that my granddaddy used to look at that gourd and see something more, see something special there, to see function and use, to see mission, to see dreams and visions that we have for this community. And the funny thing is, when you think about that mustard seed growing into a tree, you think about what Jeremiah says in Jeremiah chapter 17. He says that those who put their trust in the Lord are like trees planted down by the water, their roots watered by the stream. The idea there is that those trees, those kinds of trees, they're not going anywhere anytime soon. They're going to be around for a while. They're growing, they're reinventing themselves, they're coming to new conclusions and challenging the old ones, but they're hanging on to something that's always been there, and that's their calling, their mission, the truth that they've come to believe in.